We have a single item on our agenda.
Chair Farr?
Yes, I'm sorry,
Chair
Diana.
Farr?
Yeah.
I need to start the meeting.
Oh, sorry.
Sec. Okay, go ahead.
Good morning and welcome to the Board of County Commissioners Wednesday, November 8th regular meeting. We have a single item on our agenda this morning, Mr. Rickoff, and it's a work session, Commissioner discussion of Charter Committee recommendations, and I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce the panel and get us started.
Chair Farr, Commissioners, thank you very much. Steve Mokryski's out today and actually will be out for the rest of the week on TM, so I'll be acting County Administrator. This is a conversation that has already been started. We have a great team with Judy and Jenna here in front of us, so I'll turn it over to them.
Thank you so much, Greg. Good morning, Chair Farr, Commissioners. We were last before you on this topic on October 10th with the final recommendations from our Charter Review Committee. I'm Jenna Cusimano. I'm a staff liaison for the Charter Review Committee, as is Judy Williams. With us today, we have the Chair of the Charter Review Committee, Morgan Monroe, who will be able to help provide some context, if needed, to any of the discussions that the committee had. So, before us, we have just a general outline of the committee process. So they were initially appointed October 11th, 2022. You'll see an overview of their activities over that past year up until October 11th, 2023, just about a month ago, in which the final report was due to you all. As requested by you at that last meeting, this is an opportunity for you as a board to discuss the recommendations that they made to you in that report, and we discussed briefly on that day. And this is an overview of how we're looking to guide the discussion today. The recommendations they provided you were generally in three categories. The first was the recommended charter repeals. The second, and what we think will probably elicit the most discussion amongst the board members, is recommended charter revisions. And then finally, recommended areas for further study, which could either be done by the current formation of the Charter Review Committee. They do have until October 11th of 2024 to complete any additional requests made by the board, or just general areas that you could convene, such as a task force or other groups to look into, as they may be outside the scope of the current committee. Some general framing questions you may want to think about as we're discussing the recommendations of the committee is if you personally support the recommendation, and then independent of that, if you want to refer the issue to the voters. So any revisions to the charter ultimately do have to go before the voters to go into effect. And so these are the three recommended charter repeals. And we'll be discussing them in order. The issue paper number 3 was to repeal section 32, spending limitation. Issue paper number 4 to repeal section 33, East Alton Baker Park. And issue paper number 5, repeal section 34, income tax cap. So we'll go ahead and get into the spending limitation. So just some background, and this is all information that was provided in the final report from the committee on the recommendations. So the spending limitation was established prior to current state laws and practices that govern spending by the county. The terms used within this section are out of date. They've shifted meanings since that provision was included in the charter. And then some of the discussion that the committee had is they felt that it served no modern purpose for the county. It's out of compliance with some element. So we as an organization are out of compliance with some of the elements of that provision, and they're no longer applicable. Largely, it's served as a historical artifact now within the charter and provides no or minimal value to the county. This was also a recommendation from the 2011 Charter Review Committee, who also recommended the Section 32 be repealed, although it hasn't, which is why it's before you again as an option. Our budget manager, Christine Moody, did weigh in on this, and she supported the recommendation. And so, Morgan, if you wanted to add any further context to this, or?
I think this is one of the examples of something that was necessary when it was put in. The state didn't have the regulations and the guidelines that they currently have, and so the county did exactly what a home rule charter is supposed to do and said, this is what we need for ourselves so that we can do this well, that we can live up to this high standard for ourselves. The state caught up. And so now there's a space where the state processes and guidelines are farther ahead than this older piece of it, and we're out of compliance with parts of it. And so I think those are some pieces. The title of it being a spending limitation, I think it's a scary title because it feels like if you take it away, will there be chaos? And really what it is about process, where money goes, setting aside money if there's worker issues. It's a really old-fashioned section of the charter with a confusing title on top of it.
And so now we have some time if you want to discuss this section or any other nuances about it. And then it's up to you all, but we could look for just general head nods with each individual recommendation or a summation at the end and go through them again. I don't know, Chair Farr, if you have a feeling either way as to how you would.
If it's not going to interrupt your flow, why don't we entertain a modicum of questions as we go along and save the longer questions that require greater answers to the presentation. If that works for you all?
Well, and so we don't necessarily have a formal presentation. We did anticipate you having discussion about each item as it come up, and then we can have a general discussion at the end. For example, some commissioners may just not want to, may be supportive of individual issues, but not want to refer anything to the voters. So that was a feeling of some of the committee members as well. So it could be helpful to have both the individual discussions for each item and then a separate conversation at the end.
Let's go that direction then. So at this time, any questions for on this section?
Chair, yeah, I'm supportive of this particular recommendation. If it's not really applicable anymore, it seems like we don't need it in the charter. So I don't really see a lot of controversy over this, other than, you know, if it's referred to the ballot, we do need to be careful about explaining what spending limitation truly means in this sense, because everybody wants.
Commissioner Buck,
Yes.
can you move your microphone closer, please? I'm having a hard time getting sound. Thank you.
Better?
Sorry to interrupt.
That's all right. Is that better? Hopefully that's
Yes.
okay. So briefly, I'll just repeat that I support this particular recommendation, and my only concern is to have a good explanation when it's on the voter's ballot, because the term spending limitation will concern people. If we're asking them to, you know, repeal a spending limitation of their tax dollars in that sense, that will provide chaos, as you mentioned. And that's not exactly what this particular provision really does at all. So we just need to be careful about explaining that thoroughly to voters.
Excellent point, Commissioner. Further discussion? Oh, I'm sorry, is that? I was trying to make eye contact. There we go. Commissioner Seneca.
Yes. What part are we out of compliance with? You say we're out of compliance with part of this charter?
So I'll invite Christine Moody to speak to a bit more detail about that item.
Sorry, Christine.
That's why I'm here. Thank you, Commissioner. So it's really more about terminology changing in there, because we have never, we're not close to the spending limit as it's calculated according to this charter. We've never exceeded the spending limit. It was put into place before Measure 5 and 50 when we had permanent rates. So it was just a very different property tax structure. So it talks about things like a reserve fund. We don't do our reserves that way. They're in the general fund for cash flow. That's how we need to have them. That's recommended by Government Finance Officers Association. So it's not that we're violating anything. It's more about the terminology or the way we talk about discretionary general fund, because that's what it's referring to, versus we're not positive how they were referring to. It's not defined what was their definition of discretionary general fund back then. So those are more the issues with it, and that statement about it just not, we don't understand exactly what it's supposed to do. It's not having any impact on our spending at all. And there was the concern that if the voters ever did change taxing structures or, say that a permanent rate change, there was a statewide permanent property tax rate change or something, we would be potentially hitting up against the limit. And that wouldn't make sense because the voters and the state would be changing a system in order to give us more resources that we should spend on services. So it's really about just having the flexibility to go with whatever the changes are, and that it's not doing anything right now.
I was kind of looking at it the other way, that maybe it's good to have it in place in case the state changes and we want to use our home rule charter that we put in place. Could it be utilized that way still if it was in place?
It would stop you from being able to spend the resources that you have, though, is the potential impact. Say, I mean, this isn't the case, so I don't want to, but if our property tax rate really was higher and gave us enough resources to adequately fund public safety, what if we hit that limit? Because it's as you see, it's like a defined amount that they picked back then, and then I do the calculation every year. I go out and pull the population growth and the CPI growth and how much could we grow our fund. And again, that term discretionary general fund throws me a little bit because we have a specific meaning for it now, but if they meant something else, that's where it gets confusing. It's not defined.
Just very quickly on that, Vice Chair. So we're appointing a committee to look at the public safety. Oops, thank you.
Only if those funds were put into the general fund, right? Because again, this only talks about discretionary general fund. So our levies, if, say it was a levy, or we would put it in a special fund. All of our levies are in a very distinct fund. They don't get commingled with our general fund at all. So it is just a difference in practice too. And again, the levy, that whole state law around levies and having to put them in their own fund and all of that also happened after this was written, because this was from the 80s. So it's just a very different structure. And like was mentioned, there's safeguards in place to make sure that money is being accounted for according to its source. If it's a levy, it's in its own special fund, so it's not going to touch this fund anyway. Yeah.
You're reliving nightmares for me. I was on the school board when Measure 5 hit, and then on the Eugene City Council when 48 and 50 hit, and that changed everything.
Yeah.
Vice Chair Trigger.
Thank you, Chair. I am in support of repealing this because my understanding is it's really an artifact, and so it's sort of taking up space. And then our job becomes explaining to the voters so they understand why this matters and doesn't create a misunderstanding of of how we're managing finances. So that's a communications and a leadership responsibility we will all share should this get on the ballot, and I think we're up to that challenge. I want to ask also, and I suppose, the worst case scenario isn't even that terrible, which is we put it before the voters and they don't approve repealing it and it stays and we've lived with it, and should we ever bump up against, should we be so fortunate as to have the terrible problem of bumping up against it actually impeding our ability to fund services, we'll address it. But you mentioned that you take time every year, and I'm imagining others in the budget office staff do. So this is actually, in a way, costing us money potentially as well, maybe not significant, but it's costing time, which is money.
Yeah, it's a little bit of time. Yeah, I mean, we do have the sources to go, Portland State University, luckily, has it very defined, the population. But I also had mentioned to the Charter Review Committee that sometimes those population estimates change after the fact, because they're estimates. So they'll change after the fact. So if we have to go back and recalculate it, yes, it's taking time. I'll just add one other thing that we used to, if you look back in old budget documents, actually report on this every year. So that's why I'm looking at it. And sometimes I will look at it every other year because we're not close to it. So it's like I can go pull the data and just say, yep, if somebody asked, here's where the spending limit sits. But we would report on it to show that we had this huge gap between what voters approved us to spend back in the 80s and what we're able to spend because our resources are so low. So it used to be reported in that way. So like you said, if we were fortunate enough to have the resources that even the voters thought we should have back then, they don't realize how the number has grown, but we don't have that amount, even under this spending limit.
Thank you. And I guess really my point was people are concerned about efficiency, and it's inefficient to have to spend even a minute of staff time managing a sort of an irrelevant portion of our charter. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Further questions, comments?
Maybe just one, Chair. Just as we go forward in the discussions of what to put on ballots and all that, and forgive the lack of term here, is there some kind of volume discount that we're going to have to put stuff on the voters' pamphlet? If we just put one thing on, it's going to cost us X number of dollars, but if we put 4 or 5, is there some efficient way of putting that before the voters?
Well, so it depends as to whether they could be considered housekeeping changes and packaged together in one ballot item or not. And so that would be a question for county council to determine based on whichever measures you're wanting to put before the voters. And I mean, beyond that, for election costs, it has come up as a question for our committee members as well. There's not necessarily a lot of tangible costs associated with adding additional ballot measures to the ballot. It's more that as more items are added, they're spread out amongst the participating measures and taxing districts that are putting those measures forward. So I don't know how well that answers your question or not, Commissioner Lovell.
Okay, we'll go forward.
I'd interpret that to be there's no volume discount.
Yeah,
there's a
yeah.
Confusion potential.
Well, I just want to make sure that we're efficient about this, because I mean, in my mind, everything that we decide on has to cross my bridge of return on investment. What's the county getting from this? Are we getting value? Are we saving a significant amount of money to make this effort viable? So that's why I'm asking that question.
What we heard from, I'd say, the clerk for the county was that it's less about how much the county would have put on and who you're sharing your costs with. So if you were to put this on an election where other folks are also having things on the ballot, then you and Fern Ridge or whoever else get to split those costs. So it's more about who else can you go in on it with and timing it, and that can do a significant reduction in some of the costs. Whereas if it's an individual recall kind of a thing like we just had, you'd be stuck with all of it.
And my point was crowded ballots often are quite confusing because some people say, well, only going to take one of these. Continue. Vice Chair Trigger.
Thank you. But you did mention if it's a housekeeping item, so we can group housekeeping items into one vote. Is that correct? And then other substantive, like what is the differentiation there to the point of the chair of
Well,
too many items?
And to that end, we haven't really, because again, that's dependent on what items we're looking to move forward. So I don't know, and we haven't determined that with county council, if, for example, all repeals could be packaged together because it's simply removing language. It's not additive, and it's, nothing that can necessarily be debated. It's pretty clear that it's just a removal of a section.
So, Chair, just as a process point, I would suggest we keep moving through the items and assume somebody's tracking with the sort of the general tenor, and then we come back, as you mentioned at the end, with sort of, do we agree with the recommendation, and then the decision, do we put on a ballot? It becomes a different conversation when we have a sense of the will of the board across the items. Great, thank you.
Perfect suggestion. Just a reminder that we had Chris Sherman talk yesterday about one of these issues. So grouping them all together still doesn't make them all a single vote in people's minds, in terms of trying to understand the entire package of recommendations. Please continue.
Any further discussion on that item, or are we ready for the next?
I think we're ready. Thank you.
Okay, so our next item to review is issue paper number 4, repeal section 33, East Alton Baker Park. So the background on that, this provision about East Alton Baker Park was established when the county still owned the land, and the land has since been sold to the city of Eugene. Some discussion the committee had about that the primary value of this section is to retain it as a historical artifact. Developable land within the urban growth boundary may benefit from greater flexibility governing its use, and this section did speak about the use of this portion of land. The committee largely agreed that this provision served little purpose for the county. And both Policy Director Steve Adams and Public Works Director Dan Hurley were in support of removing this section from the charter. Morgan, did you have anything you wanted to add about this?
No, I think you covered it.
Then I'll ask a question that may come up as we go along. How deeply was county council involved in the discussion regarding any legal impact that may be a part of the recommendation?
They were involved more towards the end, prior to when we came to you with the report with the final recommendations. And so they did have an opportunity to review the recommendations, but they weren't necessarily weighing in on each individual section or recommendation that was proposed. They did ask clarifying questions as needed. I don't recall anything that came up about this specific item from county council.
Questions, comments? This is the one that Chris Sherman provided testimony on yesterday.
Correct, and we've received emails as well.
Thank you. Commissioner Bach.
Thank you. Again, I'm in support of this one. It seems pretty straightforward, although I just want to ensure you did receive emails, and we got the call in from Chris Sherman, so I just want to make sure that we were able to reply thoroughly and let people know that there's no change in the land or how it's being used in any way.
Correct. I had responded directly to an email about that topic and clarified that since we are no longer the owners of that land, that section of the charter has no applicability to what happens with the land now or moving forward. It doesn't change the current status of the land.
Seems straightforward.
Is it a bit of an indication that people take ownership in the things that we sometimes take for granted? You know, her Uncle Pre designed those trails.
Any further discussion on that item? If not, we'll be moving forward to the last repeal section, issue paper number 5, repeal section 34, the income tax cap. Background, this was established at the same time that a companion provision to create a county-level income tax was voted down. The provision restricts how an income tax would be used, but we don't currently have a county-level income tax. Some of the committee discussion, there's no current need to restrict how a non-existent tax will be spent, and any further future implementation of an income tax would be best served by the opportunity to define and determine parameters that suit that moment. Morgan, any further additions?
No, I think that is a good place to start.
Yeah, if we ever added an income tax, would that be the time to repeal this and then decide how it's spent, or could that be done in the same time?
I think those are certainly options. Right, the timing is up to the community, right? Like that would be an option to go in that way. There are lots of different ways that it could go forward.
And I would add, Commissioner, that the changing an element of the charter is a fairly drawn-out process. So if there were swift discussion on a potential future income tax down the road, to repeal the charter ahead of that may make it a little bit cumbersome of a discussion. Just something to think about. Commissioner Lovell?
So let me get clear. So you're saying, Chair, that if we clean this up now, it would be better if and when, how potentially that we did something different in the future? It would be less confusing for the voters. Is that what I heard you say?
Yes, it
Okay.
would be a more of a direct process, in my estimation.
Yeah, okay.
Did that cover your question, Commissioner Snyder? Yeah. Right, thank you.
Okay, and now we're moving on to some of the items that will have a bit more discussion, the areas in which the committee discussed and recommend potential revisions to the charter. Issue paper number 1, section 10.3C, to revise the titles and descriptions of commissioner districts. Issue paper number 2, sections 10.3D and 10.3E, revise the redistricting process and establish the independent redistricting committee within the charter. Issue paper number 6, section 35, to revise the charter review committee as described in the charter. So beginning with issue paper number 1, section 10.3C, revise the titles and descriptions of commissioner districts. For some background, The highly concentrated population growth within the urban growth boundary made the current commissioner district definitions challenging to follow, while also honoring state and federal requirements in the recent redistricting effort. Geographic associations with the titles of commissioner districts also raised concerns with the Independent Redistricting Committee. Some of the discussion within the Charter Review Committee, they agreed upon the importance of retaining the intent of preserving commissioner representation from outside of the Eugene-Springfield metro area. Due to the concentration of population growth, portions of the Eugene-Springfield metro have been included in each of the 5 commissioner districts, and the committee also heard from community members who were confused about the naming conventions of the commissioner districts. So the next slide has the current language as listed in the charter. So the highlighted yellow area is one of the primary areas that would be recommended to be changed within the revision. So removing the geographic association with the position name. And then moving on to the next slide, this shows the recommended revised language. So you will see that instead of the geographic district names, it's referred to as district number 1, district number 2, et cetera. Within those, so it still retains the general geographic description of those districts, but there's also the addition of the second part of those sentences, but also including contiguous portions of the county as necessary to comply with subsection D. So that's alluding to the need to likely include portions of the Eugene-Springfield metro area within each of the districts to be able to meet the needs for redistricting purposes.
Thank you, Ms. Kuzmani. I'm going to mention to the commissioners, I just received a message. The public is having difficulty hearing this side of the table, so if we could all move our mics forward a little bit. Forward being toward us. Thank you. So questions or comments on 10.3C? Vice Chair Trieger.
Thank you, Chair. I will just say, as someone who, for example, currently my district is called South Eugene, which is actually a neighborhood, and does not nearly represent the entirety of a really complex and diverse and much larger than a neighborhood district. And then I know I don't want to speak for Commissioner Buck, but I know East Lane includes the South Lane School District, and most people think of the bulk of her geographic district as South. So it's confusing. I agree it's confusing. And I do like this new language because it maintains the essential flavor with the descriptor, with the geographic guidance, but is less prescriptive and therefore more nimble for future boards to consider. And it's aligned with really every other public office practice in terms of using numberings. School boards use position numbers, city councils use ward numbers, state and House representatives use district numbers, congressional seats use district numbers. They don't name a geography for their district, but then it is descriptive in other places. So I am fully in support and really appreciate the committee's time on this. I know it's I will just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair Trigger. And what you point out is that other jurisdictions, the higher level, well, call them higher level jurisdictions. I've been in one of them. I don't think it's higher than this.
You've been on 2 of them, school boards and cities as well.
Exactly.
3 of them.
And the state.
And state.
But that being said, they use numbers. And if you look at House districts in Oregon and you try to figure out what to call it geographically, when Shed used to be in with the University of Oregon. Hard to call something geographically. And right now, Churchill High School in West Eugene, deep West Eugene, far West Eugene, is in East Lane. Anyway. Further discussion. Commissioner Buck.
I'll add to that because it's true. This one is actually probably especially important to me because East Lane, although a large geographic section of District 5 is not actually where a lot of the people are. The bulk of the people in District 5, which I generally just say District 5 because it's so confusing to people in general, especially if I'm in South Lane, which is a huge area. And it was confused with South Eugene. And so South Lane has always called themselves South Lane. And for them to call themselves East Lane is very awkward. And I also have a large bulk of the people in my district in West Eugene, the Churchill area, primarily, and they would not regard themselves as East Lane residents, and if it's described to them that way, they think they should be in somebody else's district, because that's not the descriptor for them and where they live. And so, although I don't particularly necessarily need the entire descriptor, I find this is a really good compromise, because it still leaves in the original intent, but also is able to really just describe by district. And as people get to understand that a little bit more, that I think it will just help residents to know who their commissioner is and who they're represented by, regardless of maybe the geographic descriptor of where they live.
Thank you, Commissioner Buck. Further discussion? Commissioner Seneca.
Yeah, I appreciate all the hard work, but I can't support changing this. West Lane is very unique, very diverse, and they're proud to be labeled as West Lane. So I've heard from some of the constituents, and they really appreciate the title, and I'll stick with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Seneca. Further discussion? Commissioner Lovell.
Thank you, Chair. I'm gonna join on that bandwagon as Commissioner Seneca. Springfield's pretty proud about Springfield. I've heard people on Main Street say we should invent T-shirts that say Springfield, we're not Eugene. That's how they take that. So I know that sometimes it's confusing, but I think that there's a branding issue that we need to also consider, that people identify with certain areas of town. They identify with a culture that's deemed who they are. I think rural folks are definitely different than urban folks, and I think having a portion of Eugene in my district is not serving of the people that I serve the majority of. So I would rather us see moving to where the districts better represent who they are, and that each district doesn't have a piece of Eugene in it. Because in my mind, Eugene doesn't need to make a decision on every district. Each district needs to make its own unique and cultural decisions on how we move forward. So I would not support this.
Commissioner Buck.
I understand what you're saying. I just want to respond that, some of the descriptors do work for some districts, but they don't work for other districts at all. It really is not an accurate description. And if you were to stay with the main descriptor of East Lane, for example, there's not enough population to actually make that work, in which case there are other areas that fit into it. And so, I mean, to have some with prescriptive descriptors and some without to accommodate the difference is also confusing. With my other rural commissioner, I completely understand that West Lane is an easy descriptor for that area, and it works. But for other areas, it's not an adequate description. So it's a judgment call, really. But I want to make it as simple as possible for residents to identify with who their particular commissioner is. And we don't get to choose who our residents are. The whole point of going through the exercise we did is that as commissioners, we are as arm's length as we possibly can be, and the people choose. So that is why I think it's so important that we really seriously consider this particular option. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Then I'll take a few words. The names of the districts don't mean a great deal to me. And I don't want to, in my mind, confuse the names of the district with the actual makeup of the district. Now, how the district is designed, that's where the discussion needs to lay. The districts that we have right now are poorly laid out. Right now, we have, in the upcoming election, The two commissioners, which are currently labeled North and South Eugene, are up on the next election. We're Eugene. Our districts, which would be Commissioner Trieger, who's currently three? I'm four. South Eugene and North Eugene. In the next election, it's the three commissioners who historically have not been Eugene. Now, each district does contain a part of Eugene, or a part of the area inside, formally, inside of the city of Eugene's urban growth boundary, but not necessarily inside the city. Right now, in this next election, not this one, the coming one in 2005, but the one in 2007, the three commissioners could all be elected from Eugene. Three who are not currently. So, for instance, East Lane, let's say City Councilor Randy Groves decided to run, lives in East Lane, in the shadow of Churchill High School. Okay, he could be elected. And in West Lane, let's say, seems to be that Lindsay Leach is going to be elected, decides to run, and wins. We now have 4 commissioners who live inside the city of Eugene. And then in the Fairmont district, I'm not sure where Alan Zelenko is, but he's pretty darn close to it. So we could have 5 commissioners, all from the city of Eugene. That's where the discussion needs to lay, not on the names of the districts. So for me, the names of the districts are completely immaterial. Numbers are fine for me, but when we have the discussion about how the districts are laid out, let's not have it political. When it's time to talk about that, let's make it not political. That's my comments on renaming it. I'm fine with this. To me, this is words that really kind of, as Commissioner Buck said, Commissioner Trieger has said, it kind of eliminates the need for labels for where people happen to live. People who go to North Eugene High School aren't in the North Eugene district anymore. North Eugene used to be in the North Eugene district. It isn't. People who live in Harlow Road, which call themselves North Eugene, ask them. They don't live in the North Eugene district anymore. So, and people in Fairmont live in the Springfield district. So anyway, so I mean, that's all words. Where we take care of that is when we lay out the districts. Commissioner?
Thank you, Chair. So since it's a discussion on this, I think we're also doing a favor to future boards and to the Charter Review Committee, as the Chair just laid out. Again, giving a little more nimbleness to have a discussion that isn't hemmed in by words, which I do think matter. And I think Commissioner Lovell brings up such a good point, which is that all of us face. None of our districts are a monolith. Each of our districts contains sort of mini districts within it, whether that's, Commissioner Buck, you have 7 incorporated cities within your district. I have 8 recognized neighborhood associations, and they're very different, and their needs are different, and even within those subgroups, there's difference of opinion. And that is just the fact of, and the challenge of serving in office and representing a district and a constituency, and sometimes it's by issue, sometimes, and always for all of us, we're also here to make sure this organization is managed in a way that is, fiscally sound and responsible and making good use of resource regardless of what district we live in or are elected to represent. So it is sort of the fundamental challenge, and the bigger districts get, right? So the hyper-local seats are a little easier to sort of know they're really reflecting what that constituency is seeking, but it gets harder the bigger you go. We're a huge county divided by only 5. I mean, 75 to 80,000 per district is a lot to manage, making sure we're responsibly and fairly representing the needs or understanding the impacts of our decisions on that district. And that's just a fact, no matter what we name them, no matter where the people serving in the seats live versus the geography they're serving. So I think it's just a good point for us to all remember we all face that challenge. So thank you.
And thank you for that, Vice Chair Trieger. Well stated. And, I'm going to say a couple more words on it. I'm the only person on this side of the table who's ever been involved in redistricting. And it wasn't with the county that I was involved in. It was the city of Eugene. And Greg, you remember this when we had a huge issue with the city of Eugene districts back in 90, after the 90 census. Where we had, it was just really mixed up because of the shift in population. So we did a really heavy lift on the Eugene City Council at that point in time. And Gary Rare at the time voted himself out of his district because it was non-political when we did it. The word geographic divisions. The river was used as a geographic division. At the time, the freeway was used as a geographic division, although everything's this side of the freeway. So we did look at geographic divisions, and we came up with what was a pretty equitable city council map. Now, the change I made, it was that I didn't want the airport to be in District 7. I wanted it to be in District 8. That was tiny. So, but, you know, that being said, this is not where the discussion is. This is almost immaterial. Let's just make it so that people aren't confused by the name of the district and the number. How can you confuse that? Although I don't know the numbers of the commission districts. I know them by name myself. That will change. By necessity. So, but when it's time for the discussion, once again, the discussion is how do we lay out the actual division of the districts, not what we call them. How do we lay them out? Thanks. Any further discussion? All right.
Well, and so touching on to that with our next item, issue paper number 2, sections 10.3D and 10.3E, revise the redistricting process and establish the independent redistricting committee in the charter. Some background on this: in 2021, an independent redistricting committee was adopted by ordinance and was established in Lane Code. The independent redistricting committee is tasked with recommending 2 to 4 maps for the Board of Commissioners to select from. And the charter states the Board of Commissioners shall, not less than every 10 years, initiate review of the population densities of each district and boundaries when necessary. This language allows for the possibility of multiple redistricting efforts within each decennial. Some of the discussions from the Charter Review Committee was about the merits of including the independent redistricting committee within the charter versus Lane Code, and we got into some of the nuances associated with that, as well as the question of where should the authority and responsibility for redistricting reside. So the charter assigns the work of redistricting to the Board of Commissioners. The commissioners task the independent redistricting committee with drafting recommended maps while reserving the right to determine which map ultimately moved forward to define those districts. So the next slide is the current language from the charter, section 10.3D. So the highlighted areas here are the ones that would be modified within the recommended revised language. I don't know if it would be helpful to read through this in its entirety for the board. Okay, in accordance with federal, state, or county census figures, the boundaries of the 5 districts shall be drawn by the Board of Commissioners so as not to deny any person equal protection of the law. The Board of Commissioners shall, not less than every 10 years, initiate review of the population densities of each district and modify boundaries when necessary. No boundary creation, position designation, or boundary change shall disqualify a commissioner from completing the term of office to which that commissioner was elected or appointed. And so the next slide, we have the recommended revised language for that section. In accordance with federal, state, or county census figures, the boundaries of the 5 districts shall be drawn so as not to deny any person equal protection of the law. So the note there is that that section by the Board of Commissioners was removed. And then the next section, every 10 years, so instead of not less than every 10 years, every 10 years in conjunction with the release of federal census data, the Board of Commissioners shall initiate a review of the population of each district and determine if a modification of boundaries is necessary to ensure equal protection under the law. If so, an independent redistricting committee shall be convened. So this is a new addition to the recommended language here. No boundary creation, position designation, or boundary change shall disqualify a commissioner from completing the term of office to which that commissioner was elected or appointed.
A lot to talk about here. The board. Commissioner Lovell?
I'll start this one off. My turn. I don't see a need to change this. The first language of what you read is fine with me. That's what I would support.
Can you just go back to, the previous slide is the same language, but highlighting what the recommended changes are?
Well, so this is the current language in the charter, and I highlighted the areas that were either removed or modified in the recommended changes.
Side by side.
Yeah, it's kind of hard with all the wordiness
I
there.
don't have this in front. I can't look at this on my screen back and forth. That's a little challenging. Okay, thank you.
Further discussion? Commissioner Buck?
There's one item in particular that I know is confusing for a lot of people, and that's the not less than every 10 years. Because less than 10 years is 2 years, 5 years, 9.5 years. So it can be interpreted in two very different legal ways, which provides considerable confusion. So I like the change. I'm supportive of an independent redistricting committee in general. I think where the rubber hits the road is who's on the committee and how that works and how you go through choosing the folks on the committee and what their actual duties are and what they present to the board for ultimate decision-making process. So in many ways, I think I feel as Commissioner Farr felt about the last one, I feel about this one. The language is clear in the recommendation, but the details are what really matters in the whole process of an independent redistricting committee in general. Thank you, Chair.
Further discussion? Commissioner Senegal?
Yeah, well, I understand the confusion of the 10 years, but I believe it is needed. It's in there because it was needed. I've watched Junction City in a year and a half, almost double in population. So those are things you're gonna have to consider when trying to keep it. Is it within 1.5% we try and keep the districts? Something like that, population-wise. So, that number's irrelevant really, but it's a pretty tight margin. So I think that's why the once in every, or not less than, is in place.
Further discussion? Commissioner Lovell?
Yeah, Chair, if I could just add some detail to my comment, because it was pretty brief. The whole idea of government maintaining its nimbleness, I think, is one of the frustrations that I have being new on to this scene. And I think the previous language of not less than, given Commissioner Senega's point about changing populations, here we are, we're in a changing economic scene, and 10 years is 2.5 terms of a presidency. Things change rather rapidly in our current culture. So I think it gives government the needed nimbleness that it could have necessarily used to its advantage, being worded the way the previous language is.
Further discussion? Vice Chair Trigger?
Thank you. I think I will just remind in this conversation that we don't have, we use census data, which is conducted every 10 years, not less than every 10 years, but every 10 years. And so trying to align the input resource that we use to the process is what this is trying to get at. And I'm hearing Commissioner Buck say, perhaps there's more discussion to be had when it's time to consider reseating a redistricting committee, that process then has its own conversation to have about how do we tighten that up and make that more, whether it's about transparency or integrity or inclusion or whatever the issues there might be, but that actually cleaning the charter up in this way will help that committee, whatever changes we do or don't make to its process. It'll make them more effective in their work and make it clearer that they're doing the work that the board needs them to do.
And I've thought about this a little bit. We have recent history to go back on. So we can see what happened in the last redistricting and how the language affected the last redistricting and the outcome that we got from the last redistricting. Whether or not you believe it ended up being a very political redistricting, whether or not you believe that, a lot of people do think it was very political in its redistricting. Then we had one roughly 10 years prior to that, a little over 10 years. We're out of compliance because it was more than 10 years. And whether or not you believe that was political, there are a lot of people think that was political. I'm not going to comment either way. I'm just going to say that a lot of people think, and really it's people on different sides of the political spectrum. People who look at the last redistricting and said, how do you have 5 commissioners in Eugene and You know, I mean, it was, and the maps that were shown, the 3 maps that were offered were, one of them included Cresswell in Eugene, and, you know, I mean, it was, there's a lot of discussion regarding the political nature of what happened in the last process. We have that to look back on. We have a failure to look back on in order to not have failures in the future. And that is really what I would like to focus on, is how do we make this as apolitical as we possibly can. The language in this, I don't know what it does for politics. I don't like every 10 years. I like not less than 10 years, personally. The rest of it I can probably live with. But there has to be more than this. The redistricting committee itself has got to be not a politically appointed committee. Last time, whether you like it or not, it was. And last time the recommendations that came forward from that committee were based on a lot of political ideology. And I will argue that, and you look at take a look at the 3 maps that were presented. So I want to eliminate that. My personal goal is to eliminate that, and so that people can't say, well, that's clearly drawn by this side or that side. What it doesn't go into here is who is the redistricting committee? How is that appointed? How do we determine what that redistricting committee is? And I think that really is a large part of the discussion that we have to have. And then what is the process? At what point does the Board of County Commissioners weigh in? So, that being said, you look like they've got something ready to say. So,
Well, just on that, the second half of this section 10.3E is related to that independent redistricting committee. So unless we have some other items we want to talk about with D, we can also bring E into it and then talk about the 2 together as they relate.
okay, so I'll say the only thing that I have an issue with on this absolutely is not less than every 10 years. I really insist that we keep not less than every 10 years in there.
And again, it's up to the board's discretion to change the language from the recommendations that the Charter Review Committee made. So there is that opportunity if you like part of the recommendation but maybe don't want to accept it wholesale and make some changes before it goes to voters. That's certainly up to you all.
And we do that at our own peril of being labeled with the other P word, peril and politics.
So the current charter language from section 10.3E simply said the Board of Commissioners shall adopt by ordinance the district boundaries as required by subsection D above. District boundaries shall be finally adopted at least 6 months prior to any election for which they are to be effective. And then the recommended language to replace that really lays out the appointment process for the Independent Redistricting Committee within the charter as opposed to within Lane Code where it was housed before. Each Independent Redistricting Committee shall be established as follows. The IRC shall be composed of 15 regular and 3 alternate members. The application process shall be laid out in Lane Code, so that would make it easier, and this is not the suggested language, but just that the Lane Code is easier to be amended and more flexible to changes as the board desires with the appointment process. From the applicant pool, each commissioner will select 1 member to serve as a regular member of the IRC. The 5 directly appointed regular members will select the remaining 10 regular and 3 alternate committee members from the applicant pool. The IRC will hold at least 10 public meetings at times and locations that will reasonably maximize access for all county residents to participate. The IRC will prepare at least 2, but not more than 4 proposed redistricting plans. The proposed plans must comply with relevant laws relating to redistricting and voting rights. Following a series of no fewer than 5 public meetings, the IRC will select 1 plan. The Board of Commissioners must adopt the plan selected by the IRC in the form of an ordinance. District boundaries shall be adopted at least 6 months prior to any election for which they are to be effective.
And I'll say that one of the things to consider with this is that we really grounded it in current practice and recognizing that that's a frustration for folks. But I wanted to recognize that. When our committee was seated, we had 5 committee members who were selected, and then they selected the rest of the committee. For the redistricting previously, they had that same process. And so in an intent to try to honor the way that the county has done things, you'll see that reflected up here. And so if that's a space where there's an interest, I think that would be interesting to understand and to figure out what that might look like. The intent of understanding how do we have our community have an opportunity to really figure out what these districts should be in a thoughtful way, in a way that involves lots of different perspectives, that honors the intent of redistricting is very much what we were getting at. Our challenge is everyone has a different opinion on how to do that and what that looks like. And so this was that effort for that. There was concern, I would say this was a really contentious subject in the committee. And so this was certainly not a unanimous recommendation, but it was the committee's recommendation. And everybody pretty much had the same, we want to figure out how to do this well. We want to do this in a way that doesn't feel like there's a thumb on the scale. So how do we do that? And it just came, there's different folks have opinions on what that looks like. And so I wanted to put that forward. Also, the opportunity in 4 to ensure that once the maps are proposed, that there would be significant opportunity to get community input. And then also, we didn't want to rule out sort of that opportunity for the community input to inform the process. So putting on a totally different hat, having served on the redistricting process before, the time frame for that was wildly abbreviated. And it was a real challenge. And so that part of, personally, my hope is that by putting in the requirement that there's a ton of public opportunity, both while things are being discussed and then after plans are proposed, would make that have to happen, because that was a real challenge with, I think, all of them. I think when you think about the public believing that a process worked well, generally it's got a slower pace and it's got lots of opportunities for transparency and input. And many of the previous redistricting efforts have struggled in, I'd say, both of those ways.
Thank you for that explanation. I'll invite comments from the board. I'll have a few things to say. Vice Chair Trigger.
Just a quick question. On the committee, was the fundamental tension over to whether to have any reference to an independent redistricting committee in the charter at all, or was it about substantive elements of the description of the?
I think both, because currently the independent redistricting committee is fully housed within the layer below the charter. And so it is entirely at the commissioner's discretion whether or not to change that and what that would look like. And so there was quite a bit of discussion about whether the independent redistricting committee portions of it should be elevated into the charter. And we looked at many different opportunities for that and the length of that and how clearly we would lay it out. That's part of why the suggestion is that the application process shall be laid out in Lane Code. Previously, we had a draft that went through the application process, and it was just a beautiful example of something that would be historically an artifact the second it was printed. Right? Like that's going to be an iterative process. You're going to want to change that. And so that was clearly a space that we decided that had no business being in the charter. And then the rest of it was, again, that question. So should it even be elevated was a very robust and thorough discussion that there was not agreement on. And once were it elevated, exactly what that would look like also was a really lively conversation.
Follow up. Can you summarize what the essential concerns were for folks who didn't think this belonged in the charter and didn't think the voters would like to be able to say they had a say in this?
I will do my best, and I'm confident that my committee members will reach out to you to either vet or disagree with the way I characterize it. The heart of it is a real question about where does the authority lie? Right? That's a huge question. And both of them are coming with both perspectives, I think, came with the idea that the responsibility and authority at heart should lie with our community and with our county. And the question is whether that is better embodied in elected commissioners, or whether that is better embodied by a, hopefully, more apolitical committee. And that, you see the challenges with both of those statements, right? Is how does either of those work? Is it appropriate for elected officials to pick their constituents? And how would you build a committee doing political boundaries that is in a political committee, right? There are challenges. This is a very nuanced issue that I think is fully in the gray area, right? And so this was our attempt to split some of those hairs and figure out how can we recognize both of those pieces, because it isn't, that's why it wasn't unanimous. And so another piece of it I'd say was, so we talked about whether, and the other one is the IRC, if you keep the responsibility purely with commissioners, then it's on y'all's discretion to put into code whether there is a redistricting committee, how that would look, how that would work. And also, who decides was another really sticky wicket, where the premise of whether or not a committee should be involved, there wasn't as much discussion as to whether or not it's a valuable thing to have. It was at least okay to most of the committee, if not everybody on the committee, like, okay. But then who decides became a really key point of where we previously, in this last effort, brought a series of maps and then the commissioners chose, right? A really different piece of this is that the series of maps are provided, the committee hears from the community, and then the committee selects the final map that would go to the commissioners. And that's a very big difference, where in the previous effort, the committee proposed maps from which the commissioners chose. And so you're looking at the responsibility and authority question at multiple points throughout the process, where we saw some pretty significant difference in perspective. I'm going to just look to my vice chair who's in the audience to confirm that I covered that. Did I hit? Great. Okay. Thank you.
Further questions?
For the moment, thank you.
Further questions, comments? Commissioner Bell.
Thank you. I think the underlying who has the authority to actually put these forward and is really important. And part of having the independent redistricting was, I think, a compromise, right? And having 3 different maps come forward was also a compromise in that balance, because ultimately the voters elect us to make these decisions, and we're on the hook for these decisions. If committee members that are chosen make the full decision, including the final map, and we're obligated to take that one map, the voters have very little recourse. There's no recourse for the responsibility of the commissioners. So I actually preferred having a few maps to choose from, because I think that ultimately allowed the Board of Commissioners that element of responsibility. And so, and I, in all transparency, I supported what the committee recommended as their first choice. I honored that choice because that's what the underlying intent was. But it is vitally important that we still, as a board, stay responsible for the ultimate decision so that the voters have that recourse. Because they can't vote for the people that are on a committee. They can apply, but that's it. So it's interesting that the final result that's being recommended just shows they're going to come up with one map and that's it and you're done. That, I think, is the one thing that I would probably alter, is having that choice of available maps, still all produced at an arm's length from committee members, but the voters will still know who's ultimately responsible. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Buck. Further discussion, Commissioner Lovell?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Commissioner Buck's comment. She did the most eloquent 3 minutes, what I would have said, hey, the buck stops here. That's a Navy term to say we're responsible, and I was not elected to give that responsibility away to a committee. So I will not be supporting major parts of this. Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner. I think it was Harry Truman that said that.
There you go.
I think everybody knows that, right? Okay, Commissioner Seneca.
Just thinking, at least 2, no more than 4. What happens if we come to 3 and it's a 5? You get 5 votes from the districting committee on all 3 maps. I mean, what would that, then those 3 maps go to the commissioners or?
So if the committee is tasked with presenting one map, it is the committee's responsibility to choose one map. And that would be for them to understand and figure out how they want to do their selection process. And so that's one of the spaces why it isn't, it's not how will you vote is declared, it's that you'll bring forward one map. And so there's lots of times when things start out as a tie, and the committee has to figure out what do you build in to your selection process. And so there's lots of different ways they could do that, but I think at that point, when the stipulation is you bring forward one, it would then be on them to figure out how do you bring forward one. And this is the sense of what goes in the charter, what is in the charter, how might one alter the charter, what would then need to live in code, like the scale of revision to code for a lot of these changes would exist. And I think that's the space of what determines it, right? I'm of the perspective that the biggest document is what then sets the tone for the other pieces. And so we wouldn't say, well, code says we can't do this. We'd say, well, code is changeable. If the voters decide to change the charter, then it would be upon the county to change the code to make that work. And it would be on the committee to understand how do they do their own internal processes. So whether the committee wanted to put that in bylaws, which I would not recommend, I would strongly recommend they put that in, their practices and how they determine to do it. But it's that cascade of authority and clarity that moves through the foundational documents for the county. It certainly would be something that committee would definitely need to consider, and I'd encourage them to consider it before they get past the midway point in the process, because it makes a huge difference to not decide that the night you're voting. That would not smell good.
Further discussion before it's my turn, Vice Chair Truman?
If you'd like.
No, go ahead.
This is a process question, so
go ahead.
more
No,
than
please.
a substance one, so, okay. So it just occurred to me, and this is a global process question for this, and I see county councils joined us, so this might also be a time to just get a little pause and talk process about bundling, how many items, the difference between repeals maybe being bundled and adds being individual. And that also speaks to, we know when we seated this committee, they are seated for 2 years, and we're a little over halfway through. So it seems to me, in theory, this could be an item where we say, this needs more discussion and study, and we won't be ready to refer it to the voters, but we might want to refer it to the voters, but maybe not ready in time for the May 24, and give us a little more time to dig in, because I agree so far with the comments, one map or plan is maybe not the way to go, but what those numbers are, and we could spend an awful lot of time saying, is it, a max of 5 and a minimum of 3, and do they give us their ranked choice recommendations, or do they just say, here's one map? That is a level of discussion that I don't know is going to move us forward today, given the breadth of what we're trying to accomplish today. So it could be a sort of put a pin in it item as its own, because I'm hearing a lot of energy and need to discuss it. So that is my process question too, is what is the word I'm looking for, the statute of limitations on recommendations of a committee that was seated for a time-limited duration on us then using those recommendations or taking action, or how we want to timeline the work.
Those are good questions, which I'll put on hold until I say my statements, but I think that's a great question, a great discussion, because you are here for one more year, and if we're not able to finalize any one part of your recommendations, why not push it forward to a separate set of discussion? And council is here, if council has anything to say about that when the moment comes. In the meantime, I got a few things to say about this, and the first off, we're not making decisions today. We're just listening to your presentation from a well-run committee. I think the committee did superb work in public outreach, bringing people in. But it comes back to the genesis that I have the issue with. Where did it start? Well, it started with 5 commissioners, each appointing 1 member. Now, on any board of commissioners, there's a potential for a majority, ruling majority sometimes, and sometimes not a ruling majority, but a ruling majority to select the ruling majority of those 5 members. And that ruling majority of those 5 members pick the rest of the members. Consequently, the problem there is that the ruling majority could potentially have, because in our one vote wins it all, 50% plus 1 wins everything system, 50% plus 1 does win everything. And then in the ultimate, there's going to be 50% minus 1 potentially that doesn't get anything to say. Because no matter what you say, we 50% plus 1 make the decision. And that's the issue that I have with this, is 50% plus 1 shouldn't be making that decision for everybody, because we are a county of almost 400,000 people. And people are left completely disenfranchised by decisions that 50% plus 1 make. And that's the system that we have. So I want to look at this in greater detail as to how we appoint this committee, how the future boards appoint committees to make it so that 50% plus 1 doesn't make the decision for 50% minus 1. And that is our system in America. That is the way we do it here. And I'm from a different country that does it the same way, by the way. So it's that's just the way that it is. And I don't, it's not equitable. And so whenever we can make a means to get around that particular system and make it more enfranchising for the people who live in every corner of the county, then we need to find a way to do that. And we're not finding it with this particular clause, this particular section that you're putting forward. So with that, Council, did you, Commissioner Trigger had some good questions regarding the authority and tenure of this committee and a couple of others.
Thank you. Regarding the authority and tenure, I do think that's a political question. And good morning, everyone. I did hear earlier, I was observing the transmission on Zoom this morning, so I did hear some questions about packaging. And I did want to address those if this is the right time, Chair. Excuse me, I've just got a little bit of a sore throat today.
Put your mic a little closer might help you.
Okay, yeah, no problem. So we are constrained by ORS Chapter 203, which has the single subject and separate vote requirements. And so when we're looking at packaging, we're looking at what is a substantive change as opposed to what is purely housekeeping. As an example of something that could be purely housekeeping is the Multnomah County changes to their charter, wherein they changed the gender designations in their charter from she, her to neutral pronouns. And that is something that affected numerous parts of the charter, but it was a consistent housekeeping change. Things that are substantive, which could include a repeal, I think would implicate the single subject and single vote requirements. And so I do anticipate, depending on the board's decision about referral, that we will likely see many pieces to these changes as opposed to one single packaged product for the voters.
Thank you, very clear.
And if I may, on that point, there would be an advantage in terms of the public education to have all of those on a single ballot in terms of the time spent educating the public, coordinating communication, those pieces, holding sessions. There would be advantage to do that all at the same time. And of course, the election, as we've said, the election you choose would make a difference. If it's an even-numbered year where the state is footing the bill for the election, that would make a difference. It does mean that there will be a more crowded ballot to your concern, but there are certainly times when the costs are borne elsewhere by and large.
Thank you. And then may I ask a question? There are two basic types of issues. There's housekeeping which you've just stated really should be handled separately because they kind of may affect each other, as in the Multnomah County example. And the others are kind of more substantive changes that actually really require some discussion, some thought. It's not just changing a word here and there that has to go throughout the entire document. If this Board of Commissioners decides that of the recommendations that the committee's put forward, if there's one of them we want to hold out, do you see any reason that we couldn't do that? As Commissioner Tree just stated, for instance, that this one issue may have a little bit more discussion and may have a little bit more community discussion when it comes to ballot time.
Provided that it doesn't lead to an illogical or sort of improbable outcome or something that the county can't utilize in terms of procedure, I do not see a legal barrier to that at all, Chair.
So thank you. Vice Chair Tree, did that cover your questions?
It does, thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, well, actually, sorry, the only other one was whether there's any time limit on using the work product and recommendations of this committee for future discussion or ballots. I assume not, but just to confirm.
In terms of a legal review and packaging, no. Thank you, Vice Chair.
We can say, hey, you're not done yet. They can't say anything about it. All right, I love that. Thank you very much, Council.
My pleasure.
And any further discussion, questions while Council is still with us at the table? Right. Well, thanks for being in the room, and thanks for answering questions that I think are really substantial to this discussion.
Of course, thank you, Chair, and I'm happy to stay. I had a conflict this morning, but I will stay for the remainder if that's all right with you.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Right.
Okay, and then the final issue paper regarding a revision to the charter is issue paper number 6, section 35, revising the Charter Review Committee as stated in the charter. Some background on this item. The dates specified within the charter relate largely to the 2011 committee and haven't aged well. The current language allows for only 1 year for the committee to provide their recommended changes, as you saw with the current iteration of the committee providing their recommendations 1 year following their initial appointment. Constraining the work of the Charter Review Committee to 1 year limits the effectiveness of this effort. Some of the discussion from the committee, very specific historical dates are unnecessary going forward. A 1 year limit on the work of the committee, reduced opportunities to engage with the public and seek input, as well as reduced opportunities for the committee to engage more deeply with the charter and possible recommendations. We did hear from committee members that they really were interested in doing more outreach, especially to our rural communities and providing in-person opportunities, but the limited term in which they had to provide the recommendations back to the board prevented them from doing so. So we can go to the next slide, which shows the current language within the charter. So the primary changes were just updating the dates that are highlighted. So every 10 years, beginning in 2011, the Board of County Commissioners shall convene a Charter Review Committee to review the existing charter and make recommendations to the Board of County Commissioners regarding suggested changes to the charter. Membership. Each member of the Board of County Commissioners shall appoint a member to the Charter Review Committee by July 1st, 2010. The appointees to the Charter Review Committee shall nominate additional persons to fill 2 at-large positions. At-large appointees shall be appointed by the Board of Commissioners as a whole. The members of the committee shall serve at the will of the appointing commissioners, but for no longer than 2 years from the date of appointment or until the assigned tasks have been accomplished. Subsequent Charter Review Committees will be appointed in the same manner every 10 years. Time frame. Members shall begin meeting to review the current charter and shall report back to the Board of County Commissioners with recommendations for any suggested changes no later than July 1st, 2011, and every 10 years thereafter. So in the next slide, you'll see the recommendations section. So the primary changes are around those highlighted sections that had the dates in there. So replacing 2011 with beginning in 2034. And then in the membership section, changing the shall appoint a member to each subsequent Charter Review Committee by July 1st of the year of that each subsequent committee is convened. And then in the time frame, members shall immediately begin meeting to review the current charter and shall report back to the Board of County Commissioners with recommendations for any suggested changes no later than 2 years from the date each subsequent committee is convened. So removing that 1-year requirement in reporting back with their recommendations. Morgan, did you have anything to add with any of those specific changes?
Yeah, the majority of these changes are for clarity. And the primary difference that's substantive would be not requiring a report at the 1-year point and allowing for however the committee work to be done as directed by the commissioners. And so that I'd say is the biggest substantive piece, is that the previous required a report be provided before 1 year is over. And this removes that requirement, but allows for the committee to serve for 2 years, which would allow the commissioners who direct the work of the committee to then say, we would like a report by this point, we would like this. It allows for a little more leeway for y'all. It's, as you can imagine, the time it takes to learn our county's charter is significant. The time it takes to investigate and understand what parts of it are serving our county well, what parts are not, let alone to suggest a change to it, a whole cloth or just a revision, is really a significant amount of undertaking and community input and involvement. We spent a massive amount of time hearing from the fantastic professionals within the county as to how it was working, how it was going for them. And when you look at some of the other communities that have undergone this process and have had something more like this, which is 2 years to do the work, figure out the best way for you to spend it, they've been able to do much more community outreach, much more community involvement, and also their work product is significantly more robust. And so I think that's something that we looked at, because as we were going through, we'd look and say, well, what happened in this county when they did it, or this county? When we were looking at the commissioner question that we viewed earlier, you know, some of the questions to us were, well, how many county commissioners should we have? Right? Like, and that's just not like a over iced tea, let's have that conversation. That's a, what do other counties have? How does this go? What do we hear from the Association of Oregon Counties? Let's hear from the policy director. Let's do this. Let's see this. Why did we move to 5 commissioners from 3? You know, how does it work elsewhere? And so for something that we eventually discarded and said, yes, we should 5 is our recommended number to keep, it's a significant amount of time and work to even vet and verify that we would recommend that stay the same. And so when we're looking at the scale of work, it really might benefit future committees to have longer time and a little bit more freedom in how they spend it.
One quick point that I just wanted to make too, Chair, on the date, so it says 2034 in that first paragraph. We also talked a little bit more so from the staff perspective of splitting these 2 very large tasks. So redistricting effort every 10 years, or not less than every 10 years, and then the Charter Review Committee following right thereafter. And so a little bit of the conversation happened and took place to try and give a little bit of separation. So I think this date also tries to include that conversation, just to kind of give staff a little bit of a breathing room in between.
Let's go to questions, comments. Vice Chair Freer.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for that comment. It's a perfect springboard to what I wanted to ask is, was there discussion about not putting a date, a year at all, to untie the hands of having to change the charter again, and instead some kind of language that works backwards from yay many years after the most recent change to this item, or something that takes it out of a date specific but puts a timeline in place? And then the only other comment for this round I have is, I do agree we need to build in a little more nimbleness as much as possible for potential service disruptions or abilities. As we now know, things like massive mega wildfires, global pandemics, things that can disrupt workflow, can really impact county staff ability and capacity to support committees effectively, committee members to participate. I think as much as we can do to put specific amounts of time guardrails without dates is helpful.
So we discussed that somewhat, and I would say, because it's at balance, because what one could do is just say every 10 years, the Board of County Commissioners shall convene. You could say every decade, the county commissioner shall convene. That gives you, still within a base 10 system, like your 10-year window, because part of the challenge is 10 years following, like if you'd said not sooner than 10 years following the previous committee, part of the challenge with our most redistricting effort most recently was that it was much later because the federal census data was much later because of all the reasons why the federal census data was so much later. And a couple of those cascade, and suddenly you end up with, well, we could do it in, 2049 and then 2055, but how do you get back in the right cadence with that? And so if that was a concern, I think something like, each decade, the committee would do that. Then I would say that's not a committee recommendation, but that's the kind of thing that we would have discussed, that we did discuss, is trying to figure out how do we get that? And that's where, beginning in 2034, that was how we hit it, because the previous one just didn't age well. And so with that allows you that it doesn't necessarily need to be revised. Like 40 years could use that, 50 years could use that. And I always love that stance of how will this stand the test of time? Are we cleaning up a project in a way that makes a mess for 10 years from now? And so that is how we landed on the 2034, particularly with the redistricting question. So I think currently it does honor that by the skin of its teeth. And if you wanted to loosen it, there's some options that could be a little more space. But it also then wouldn't, someone might be 11 years out, someone might be 9 years out. And so it's just which side of that you want to land on.
Thank you, Vice Chair, for a good question. And what you're talking about is what we in the Army called hitch step march. We're out of cadence, hitch step. So, yeah, okay, good. And hitch step's not a fun thing to do, but you do it and nobody else has to worry about it. So, yeah, great. Discussion? Okay.
I guess, excuse me, Chair, forgive me, this may be a naive, obvious question, but in membership, it says that now you're only doing 7 board members. In the previous slide, we were talking about 18.
Oh,
So what's the differentiation here?
Sure. So the previous slide was about redistricting, and this is about the Charter Review Committee.
Gotcha, so 2 separate committees. I want to make that idea
Totally.
for the public.
Yep.
That was kind of confusing for me a little bit.
Yep, yeah.
Any further questions on this one? Yeah, go
I
ahead.
have to, again, this is very semantic and in the weeds, so I'm not sure it's the right time, that's why I was hesitating, but because we're talking about, every 10 years versus not less than, or once, each decade. Doesn't tell you how many times in a decade. So we're just trying to avoid that. There's a sentence that says, at-large appointees shall be appointed by the Board of Commissioners as a whole. Consensus, simple majority, as a whole is a vague term when it comes to what constitutes a passing vote. So just cleaning that language up would be something I think we might want to
Really,
look at.
50% plus 1 is a whole.
Well, and I think that's the question of what lives in the charter versus the code versus committee bylaws. And
So just eliminating as a whole might accomplish that better then.
great.
Appointed by the Board of Commissioners, period.
Okay, thank you.
The work of the board is described pretty clearly. It is 50% plus 1. Okay.
And so then the remaining,
Pardon me, one second. Council, I kind of informally asked you, did you have anything you need to add to that?
Oh, thank you, Chair.
Very good, thank you.
so then the remaining areas related to recommendations from the committee were recommended areas for further study. So these were issues that the committee had discussed, but either did not feel that they had the capacity or enough time to be able to fully investigate, or did not necessarily feel like that they were the appropriate party to be reviewing in depth. So this included issue 10, whether campaign finance limits should be established and whether or not that would be appropriately housed within the charter is another aspect to that. Issue number 11, section 1, whether to retain the county name. And I know this has come up a fair number of times. As to whether or not we should change the county name, that would be a very large undertaking and would likely take much longer than the remaining year of the Charter Review Committee's term. And also, it was the feeling both of the committee as well as Latife Amato, our equity manager, who did present on this item, that that should maybe be more a community-supported initiative and not necessarily the work of the Charter Review Committee, which was in bulk appointed by the Board of Commissioners. Issue number 12, section 19, whether to change which positions are directly elected and which are appointed. So there was discussion within the committee about various elected positions and appointed positions as to whether or not they should change their status. For example, our county administrator is appointed, our tax assessor is elected, our county clerk is appointed. So there's discussion about these roles and others. So that could merit further investigation either from this Charter Review Committee or another task force, or however the board should feel that's most appropriate. And then issue 13, whether some means of ranked choice voting should be adopted. So there was interest from a number of the committee members, but just did not feel like they had enough time to fully investigate that properly. But there was definitely some interest into looking into that further.
So do we have agreement as a slate is one thing to consider? Commissioner Buck.
Thank you, Chair. I have a more overall question, which is two-part. One, I know that we did the survey for the community, and for me, that's really impactful because if some of the people are not, if people are not interested in any one of these four, I am inclined not to pursue it. But if some are popular with the public, then that furthers maybe a argument to pursue it. But the second part of that is really if we choose to pursue any one of these four, is that where we as a body could request that the Charter Review Committee extend time and go into that particular subject and report back? Yes. Okay.
You certainly could. That could be an avenue in which the committee could continue some of their work, or, for example, as we discussed earlier, if you were wanting them to clean up or amend some of their recommendations to potentially put an item on the ballot, that could be another avenue where they could work. It's really dependent on where you feel their work could be most appropriate moving forward.
And Council, that seems consistent with what you stated earlier. Is that?
I think that's appropriate, yes, Chair.
Vice Chair.
If I could, thank you, a brief follow-on. If there are additional items, if the committee is going to continue its work, that members of the board would like to ask the committee to look into and bring back just informationally, is that also an option, given that we seated this committee at one time? Can we add items for them to consider?
It's within their scope, yes.
When process-wise is, I guess, toward the end, we can talk about these four and if there's anything else, if the will is to keep the committee functioning for the duration of its term. Okay.
Seems clear.
Great.
Very good. Thank you.
So that was all we had to discuss. So we had gone through all of the recommendations. We can go through them again just by title, just to see if there's general interest from the board in pursuing any of these recommendations. And then we can also talk about those recommended areas for further study, and then where, if any, areas you see the committee could be used to further their work in any of those issues.
There's another option. The Community Health Council, when we get to the end of our agenda before the allocated time, we play bingo. So, no, probably not okay.
That's how we could pick our review committee.
Just add a bit of a smile to that. So any further discussion then regarding general comments, general directions? Commissioner Buck?
You know, my preference is to clean up our charter before we start adding stuff. So I would suggest to my colleagues that we we further the work on the 3 repeal items, the first 3 items that we went over, in pursuit of eventually putting them on the ballot at some point, just to keep the charters clean and easy to read or understand as possible, and pursue that first. And then, you know, on the revisions, I guess it might require us to vote on which ones we want them to pursue on the revisions. It sounds like specifically on issue paper number 2 regarding the independent redistricting committee, we can maybe siphon that off to a further work session at another time. But personally, I would go through the repeals first and ask the committee to, you know, get that as clean as possible to pursue something on the ballot, and then maybe do a separate item on the revisions, and maybe we could pick which ones before we then pursue like further study options. And I personally would prefer not to pursue study options that were clearly unpopular with the public, so I'd pick out the ones that actually had support to pursue.
And just to clarify, Commissioner Buck, when you're talking about having the committee continue their work regarding the repeals section, so since those sections are primarily just removing entire sections from the charter, would you envision their work be relating to outreach and engagement with community about that potentially being on the ballot?
Absolutely. I mean, you know it the best, and you're out in the community already. But I don't know what else that would entail, honestly, because to get it on a ballot, there's definitely further work to pursue, and that may require a separate group in order to do that work. So I'm open to suggestions.
And thank you, Commissioner Buck, for bringing that all up, because that's kind of my next question. What is the next step for the Board of Commissioners regarding this process? And what Commissioner Buck is suggesting is that we kind of divide it into 2 processes, and the second part may be A, B, and C, but the first process is fairly clear. Let's do the repeals as a block, as a slate, and move forward with the public process to make that happen. And then we begin a further discussion on the charter changes, the actual changes, which may involve maybe some more public outreach, maybe some more discussion, certainly some more discussion among the board, and maybe division of those different items into different timeframes when we discuss them even. So is that kind of consistent with what you
Yeah,
said?
absolutely, because this is a great work session for today, but I think it warrants further work sessions.
So as far as direction to staff, then, and I'll look around the entire board, what Commissioner Buck is suggesting, it seems kind of like a clean suggestion to me, is that we move forward with the repeals. What is not that we do it, that we go into the process on the repeals. And then on a separate channel, we start to look at the recommended changes in the charter. And then probably on a third channel, the things that you decided not to talk about at some point in the future, do we want to ask the public if any of these things are important. So that's kind of a 3, very
And
light 3.
I will just say, with regard to the areas for further study, from the surveys that we had issued, campaign finance limits were of high interest to the responders of the survey, so definitely not a majority of county voters by any means, but that there was a strong indication for that. And it was kind of a mixed bag with the remainder. We didn't have the opportunity to go to the community about ranked choice voting because it was a very complicated issue to explain in a survey, and that was an area where they had thought that focus groups and more in-person engagement, particularly with the rural areas of the county, would be useful.
And on some of these, it is also the question of how fast is Salem moving on some of these, because a few of these are things that are showing up there. And the question is just what would that activity look like? How would it impact the county? How might it change expectations and norms for the whole state around ranked choice voting, whatever form you use, local campaign finance laws, some of those spaces. And so that was a question we also had of recognizing who is the right group to look into that, and also if that was going to be something that was going to change statewide in the near term, it may or may not be a place we want. And so those were some considerations, which is part of why they ended up in our murky section here at the end.
And that seems a prudent approach. You know, the ranked choice voting, for instance, that, remember Kevin Hornbuckle, 1995, we had a long discussion regarding that. And then, of course, Mark Frohnmeyer's been researching and putting forward star voting. That's a community-wide discussion, so very good. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate Commissioner Buck kicking us off with that framing. I agree. I think just pulling back up to the 10,000-foot level, the purpose of the charter should be, right, the focus should be simplicity, neutrality, functionality for the organization to operate, and particularly simplicity and neutrality for the public and for future boards. And so pulling things out that, at least at first pass, seem to be, as you say, sort of artifacts, helps us get there. And then we're considering something that's a bit of a cleaner slate to begin with, to say, well, what do we want to add and how does it make sense as it relates to organizational functionality and so on and then there's actually the third bucket of things that didn't get a thorough issue paper because of time and so on. So I'm fully in support if process-wise, and I'm looking to our staff leadership, our legal and administrative leadership, that to bring back to us, as if, I guess it's a head nod thing, as a next step to say what would it look like and what would the process be to consider these 3 repeal items, and then a future date to say how are we going to get into discussing the potential adds, and then thirdly an assignment to pursue or not pursue more research on the ones that went without that depth, and if there's any topics to add. So I see it as sort of those 3.
I think the 3 of us said the same thing.
Yeah.
And Judy, you've been writing. Did you kind of capture that?
No, Chair and Vice Chair, these are great points, and I think that is what we were looking for a little. I mean, happy to have that discussion on all of these. Happy to have the further work session in the future to further discuss some of these. But I think the next steps, like if there was head nods, if there was agreement in moving the 3 repeal, that would be direction to staff to then we would select a team. And it's really just, identifying the staff response, looking at timelines, looking at all of the points, legal aspects, and just put a plan in place in terms of next steps moving forward and which ballot and following those timelines and keeping you in the loop. That would be coming back to the board and placing an item on the ballot. At the same time, potentially having a further work session to dive in a little bit deeper. That's certainly something that we could do. One note, and I believe Jenna might have talked about it, but my concern a little bit with moving some items to the committee for further discussion. We did a very kind of quick poll of the committee, and I think some are on board to be there and be available, but I just want to be clear too of voicing some concerns around timing and commitment. So while there's, I think we have about 5 members who are willing to sit with another year on that committee, we're looking at a process too around what that would look like. So while saying that, I think there's a number of these items, certainly the item about, name of Lane County, any of those topics can also just be, when the board is interested in doing that, select a task force or select, a committee group to look into that for further discussion at any point in time. So just trying to think through that process of how that would work best with a committee when we've kind of loosely had them for 1 year with a potential for 2. the reality of that.
Good, very well stated, and I see council kind of nodding throughout your, what you were saying. So what you're suggesting then is that we are able to move forward with the repeals, presuming that this board is concurrent in that, and it looks like we are. Commissioner?
Well, I asked last time, and I don't know that we got a number. What does it cost to get these repeals on the ballot?
Well, and I think there's so many dependents, but I think, we're getting more towards narrowing the scope. I think, when we were talking about many items, it's really hard to narrow that down. So I think when we create this team and, if the board's direction is to move forward and pursue repealing these 3 items, that team really looks at timing and getting everything in place. We do our best to communicate and get some estimates, but as it's been stated, there's just so many unknowns with who else is going to be having measures on the ballot. We have some, I think in 2020, I believe, was the last time I worked on the OSU extension levy item going on the ballot, and again, it's kind of the timing and who else is on the ballot, but just as an idea, that was around $28,000. So just to kind of throw out a number, I don't know that that's going to be very helpful because of how dependent.
Well, and then we also have from 2012, the last time the Charter Review Committee put 3 measures on the ballot. At that time, it cost about $71,000. But just as a note, the county does not officially reimburse the elections office for that election expense. So it's just spread out among those participating jurisdictions that are also on the ballot.
Which in a May or November ballot of 25 would be a lot, would be spread out pretty broadly. Okay. Does that cover that, Commissioner Zuniga? Commissioner Pop?
As a follow-up, maybe when we come back with the 3 repeal items, you could narrow down and present some cost estimates at that time. And knowing that these are concepts that have been vetted already, if we put it, say, on the November ballot next year, when there's a lot going on and probably the cheapest way to share costs, what would the potential, our portion of the potential costs for those 3 repeal items be? That would be a way to narrow it down enough where we might get some better cost estimates, perhaps.
Welcome to the final decision point on it.
Right.
Scenario.
Yeah.
Right.
Costing, we do that all the time.
So there's that portion, and then the second portion, which we'll address as a board separately and in order, which is the recommendations for changes. And then the third section, which is potential future discussion items where we'd involve the community as to which one of these may you be interested in looking at. So 3 different parts. Judy, I think you outlined that very well. Any concerns with the way Judy said that? I think, no, it wasn't in absolute minutia, but just a general concept that you put forward. Judy, I think you captured what we're talking about pretty well. Any discussion surrounding that? Jenna, did that sound right to you? Chair?
Yes, and I would encourage anything coming back to the committee to have a really, really clear charge. And I'd also like the opportunity for staff or the committee to work together and identify many of these next steps may best reside with staff. And so I think there's that space where some of the research and the work to understand what the committee might recommend is very much, to me, suits the committee. Some of these other pieces might better be done by staff. And so just that opportunity to acknowledge that when the work, if you're heading the work to this side of the table, if it's all right with you, that we figure out sort of the best way to handle that. Because I think as we go through it, much of it will move out of the committee's hands and into staff and the county's hands. And many of these things also might best be served by a specific group looking into them who has either a content expertise, relevant representation, the timing for when you all might want to do that, right? Very much a space of saying some of these later pieces that may warrant further study may warrant their own study.
And in the meantime, we have to consider the appetite of the of the committee members for continuing their work.
Yes.
And if they don't wish to, how do we backfill?
Yeah, how do we backfill? What, do we leave them unfilled? Do we have to hit a quorum because we're a committee? Do we become a task force? I don't necessarily understand the specific parameters that would be required from the county side, but those would be questions that might be helpful to look into for us to understand what future work would look like and how to do it within bounds.
Well, I'd like to personally thank you for the work that you and the committee put in. And to bring it, this is no small amount of work that brought you to this point of the discussion. And I think we're at a point right now, Judy, where we've heard what we need to hear and given you direction as to how to move forward. We'll see how you move forward with that. And any discussions or comments before we adjourn today?
I just, Chair, have one kind of humoristic comment, the way it's in my mind. I mean, when we develop things, we have stud walls up. I'm the guy who goes in after all the workers leave, and I vacuum out all the crevices before the sheetrock goes in, because I want to clean up that thing, because it's important to me, but I'm not willing to pay for it. So this is a lot like this. You know, these repeals are a lot like, yeah, we could clean this up, but, you know, am I willing to pay for it? Am I getting a return on my investment? So that's just where my brain's at. So there you go. Thanks for letting me share that, Chair.
Construction part, when you seal in the stairwell, you leave the debris there, or do you clean it out?
No, you clean it up.
You leave the debris there because nobody's ever going to see it, or you clean it out because nobody's ever going to see it. Two different forms of.
But it makes me sleep at night, you know what I mean?
Well, that was a little bit far afield. Very good, then. Any further business before we adjourn today? Ms. Rickoff?
Sir.
Council? Very good. And instructions are clear. Once again, I hope you heard how thankful we all are to the work that you all put in.
Yeah, good job. Super job.
Very good. We are adjourned.
Thank you.